love what you mentioned about the free will, like God's free will. And I got this insight one time, just contemplating, and was asking the question of like, why is all this stuff happening? Like the wars, racism, and everything else. And this answer came to me so subtle that it said, God loves us so infinitely and so unconditionally that he allows each and every one of us to do what we please with that love and energy. But even whatever we do is still in the divine will, because God has solutions for everything.
There you go.
And it's all playing its part, the collective part, for all of us to ascend. Like you said, we're all going to get there. And that was just something I just got a meditation, but I felt so at peace of hearing it that way. But
That's
then
it.
obviously this ego part of me that came in like, no, that's not right. People shouldn't be killing each other. People shouldn't be looking at each other based upon their colors or
Yeah.
their sex, their sexual preference and everything else. That's not right. It's like this part of me that's like judging, pretty much. I'll be honest. That
Oh,
ego
yeah.
part of me that's judging.
That's fantastic, man. Let's look at that as well. I have a number of definitions that I like to use for ego that are different ways of capturing what it is. The first one is ego is the mental activity of identifying with everything. It's the I this, I that, I'm this body, I'm this person, I'm thinking this, I'm doing that. But we could also say that ego is the mind's war against reality. It's the mind's conflict against reality, that reality is wrong and I am right. Reality has made mistakes that I can fix if I can have control. And one of them is the one you just said of, oh, bad things are happening. They shouldn't be happening, which means reality is bad or wrong, and I can correct reality. So you have these thoughts like that thing, war, racism, segregation, judgment, whatever, shouldn't be happening. And so question those thoughts and say, is that true that that shouldn't be happening? Let me play around with the opposite thought and see how it feels. All of that stuff should happen. And just let me sit with it and not judge that thought. And then that recognition that you just talked about starts to come up. You go, oh, actually, yeah, all those people believe they're separate from each other. They all believe that they're lacking and incomplete, and they're all afraid of the future. So yeah, they definitely should be going to war and hating each other and all that stuff, because that's what they believe is true. So from that perspective, reality is perfect. So then you see the deeper layer of reality of, oh, everyone is acting perfectly according to their state of consciousness. And that's why reality is perfect. Not because nothing troubling or painful or challenging ever happens. That's not what perfection means. Like if I go through a challenge that's difficult, that's a perfect challenge, isn't it? It's perfect in what it's meant and designed to be. And again, all of that stuff, all of it is just contrast for self-knowledge. Because when you get free from those beliefs and those misperceptions of who you are, once you're free, I promise you, there's nothing in its wake. There's no footprints behind you of like, oh, I'm glad I'm free, but man, I'm upset that I suffered all those years. No, that's not how you feel, right? You realize, all my suffering was like a bad dream that didn't ever happen. Like you don't suffer from your nightmare when you wake up because you go, it wasn't real. Yay, I'm free. And that's what liberation is. I like to call it freedom before, not freedom from. If I'm free from something, that's implying that I was actually in bondage, right? So that's not real freedom. Because if what I am can be in bondage ever, that implies that it could happen again, maybe. So I'm not free from anything. I'm free before. I was never really in bondage. It was always just an illusion. It was ignorance of the truth. And that's the only recognition that can really bring peace of mind.
We've got a question.
Yeah. So it seemed like we're taking a little dive into the ego because somebody had a question about the ego for you.
Yeah. And the question is coming from Sam. It says, do you think there's any benefit from the ego, or do you think at a certain point or age it isn't necessary? Or yes, she says, where it isn't necessary. Got it.
Yeah, great question. And the answer is yes. The ego is absolutely necessary and provides a huge benefit. Because without ego, we wouldn't have liberation. We wouldn't have freedom. The ego is that device, we could say, that the source is using to experience all that contrast and eventually discover itself. So think about what it would be like to be one infinite eternal being that has never been born and never dies. And it's just you. There's nobody else around, right? So you can't like have a conversation with someone and be like, hey, can you tell me like what I'm like? Like, tell me about my attributes and my nature. There's nobody else. Who are you going to talk to? So Source has to come up with some device or way of discovering and experiencing itself. And so it does that through this dream world of duality, the universe, of experiencing what it's like to be separate from its true nature. And although there's not another being that can tell it what it's like, it can sort of experience the opposite of what it's like: fear, separation, anger, sadness, and all of that. And then through that contrast, it can now understand what its real nature is like: love, peace, joy, oneness. Now those things actually have meaning. Whereas before, it's just what I am. I don't know anything else. So ego is that amazing genius device that divine intelligence made to give us this dream of being separate, so that eventually at a certain point when the soul is karmically ready, it will have that realization that I am the source of everything. And it will mean something at that point. That's what ego's for.
Got it. So duality to experience oneness.
Bingo.
Yeah. We have one more question for you, Aaron, and it comes from Michelle. Michelle says, is there a connection between the ego and fear? Fear of negatively polarized people or entities?
Oh, we're going law one now. Let's go.
Let's go.
Let's go.
Yeah, so, A Course in Miracles says the ego is the belief in separation, which is a perfect definition. I like to break separation down into those three beliefs, because it's like, well, what does it mean to be separate? What happens when I believe I'm separate? Well, what happens is I think I'm lacking, I attach to things, and I think I'm in control. That's how separation plays itself out in time space. So fear is, the Course describes it as the ignorance of love, right? Fear is the path of separation. If I think I'm separate, fear is there. So that's really all ego is fear, right? It's the fear that I'm separate, and so I may be annihilated. All of the ego's fears, no matter what it is ultimately the fear of death, of annihilation. That's why ego fears enlightenment, because ego thinks, well, I won't exist if enlightenment happens, so let me stave that off as long as possible. And really, ego's death is inevitable, right? Whether this lifetime or the next lifetime, you're going to know who you are. You're going to find out who you are at some point. So I just say, well, if I know that's true, might as well find out in this lifetime, right? Might as well go for the highest purpose. But yeah, fear of negatively polarized people or entities, that's just another way of saying the belief that I'm separate from someone. The person who knows who they are doesn't fear anything. Like Ra says in the Law of One, love is the strongest defense that there is. You don't need any other defense other than love. Because when I know I'm not separate from you, when I know that you're also the source, what is there to fear, right?
Yeah. It reminds me, because like obviously in regards to the fear of like negative people or entities, it's reminding me of my religious upbringings, of thinking about like, the devil's gonna get you. There's demons, there's people who practice evil stuff against you and things like that. But like this oneness, but also connecting to who you are, who you truly are beyond that, in that space. I asked this like curious question, because I'm like, is God afraid of itself? If it's all oneness, so doesn't it mean that like even those things that you're potentially afraid of that are trying to happen to you is really God, experiencing God through those things, but really you're the space of all of this as well?
Yeah. that when that question enters your mind, especially if you're a religious person like we used to be, it instantly breaks down everything. It's just
Yeah.
everything unravels like a ball of yarn from that one question. Because when the truth of oneness really dawns upon you in your awareness, then it automatically means there can't possibly be something other than God.
Yeah.
You know, that there isn't a second being in the universe if God's omnipotent.
Yeah.
So that means there's no devil, there's nothing to fear. And so then it's like, okay, well, that resonates. You know, when I was coming out of Christianity at 23, I felt the truth of oneness and went, that is the highest truth. Nothing but God exists. But then why does there appear to be evil? Why does there appear to be a devil or negative things? And so the next question was, well, is that happening on accident, like Christianity says? Right? Christianity says God had this great plan in mind, and then one of his creations like went and screwed it up against God's will, and God was like, I'm gonna get you back, devil.
Yeah.
And God has this revenge plan in mind, and has to murder his son and stuff to forgive people. You're like, okay, so that puts God in this like imbecile position of not knowing the future, and his plans got foiled by something far inferior to him. You're like, I can't resonate with that. So then, what we call evil must be playing some purpose. It must not be an accident. So I just have to figure out why it's not an accident. And as A Course in Miracles says, I remember the place I was sitting when I read this quote. It's burned into my brain. The opening line from A Course, nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists, and herein lies the peace of God. So evil is that which isn't actually real. It's the ignorance of what's true. And because it doesn't have its own existence apart from God, then there's nothing to fear about it. That's the underlying truth of oneness.
Wow.
Yeah.